My name is Dr. Myke Eden. Thank the organisers for the opportunity to speak to you today. In the next 20 minutes or so, I hope to explain to you that the development of vaccines against this alleged pandemic virus was not an appropriate thing to do. And I think more importantly, that the design choices about the vaccines, the so-called vaccines, were in every case the consequence of producing toxicity and harm in human beings. And I'll finish with some questions for you. So first, a little introduction to myself. I'm a semi-retired lifetime research scientist. I've worked in the biopharmaceutical industry for over 30 years. My first degree was in biochemistry and toxicology. I followed that with a research-based PhD in respiratory pharmacology, so the effects of drugs on respiration and respiratory function. I worked in the Wellcome labs, briefly Glaxo Wellcome, and then for a long time at Pfizer, where I left them in 2011. I was vice president and worldwide head of research in allergy and respiratory medicines. In the next 10 years, I worked as an independent. I consulted to 30 biotech companies, and I also started, ran and sold my own biotech company, Ziarco, in 2017. I was doing a limited amount of consulting when the alleged pandemic started in 2020, and I had plenty of time to pay attention to what was being said to me on television. And I quickly deduced and calculated that we were not being told the truth about whatever was going on. So with that as a background, let me just jump past all of the, in my opinion, lies, deceptions, and hurts of the last few years, and just say why I am sure, and I can hope to persuade you, that the development of vaccines, the decision to develop vaccines, was an obviously inappropriate, impractical, improper strategy, even if what you were being told was true, which it was not. Why? Why am I saying that? Well, if I look through the history of the development of vaccines, I don't think you're going to find very many that were developed in less than about 6 years. Now, that's because it involves first discovering or inventing the material you hope to make into a vaccine, and conducting preclinical toxicology in test tubes and in animals, and then a staged series of tests in human beings to see if it works and if it's safe. But it's much more than that. You have to manufacture on scale a complicated biological material, and the processes required to make sure you have control of this complex biological manufacturing process itself takes no less than several years. It cannot be done faster. It doesn't matter that you want it done faster. It doesn't matter how much money you spend or how many people you apply to it. Some of the processes can't start until the results of the process ahead of it is known. And the long and short of it is, ladies and gentlemen, it's absolutely impossible, laughable as to someone like me, to pretend that a vaccine was conceived, created, tested, manufactured and authorized in under a year. So I'm telling you for absolute certain, after 30 years in this industry, that is not what happened. Something else happened. There are other reasons why you wouldn't make a vaccine. In this particular case, a very important one is there has not been a pandemic. If you look at the work of Dennis Rancourt in Canada, you will find there's no evidence whatsoever of increase in all-cause mortality until the WHO, in my view, fraudulently declared a pandemic. So there's not been a pandemic. There were an increase in deaths, of course. What you probably don't know is that these only started to increase after WHO fraudulently called a pandemic, and they flowed from 3 major changes to medical management in Britain and every other country I've been able to find out. First, in hospitals, people who arrived and were declared COVID positive Many of them were put on ventilators. Now, I can assure you, my PhD being in the field of respiratory control, I know quite a bit about this, and it's not appropriate. If someone is breathing and doesn't have chest wall damage, you don't sedate, intubate, and ventilate. If you do that, especially if the person's frail, you're really quite likely to kill them. And in my view, large numbers of people were killed as a consequence of being wrongly treated in hospital. It wasn't an accident. That protocol was imposed upon them, upon every country from on high. It wasn't worked out by your local doctors in the hospital. The second way in which large numbers of people died, and it was nothing to do with COVID because it doesn't exist, is in old people's homes, care homes. Very many people were given sedative drugs and drugs that slowed their respiration. Midazolam and morphine were two very common drugs, and they were used at doses that caused people to literally fade away. They were given effectively lethal injections, even though they weren't about to die. So those two things, I think, account for or can be described as medical murder. The third category of increased deaths that resulted from changes in medical procedures were people in the community. You and me, you might have got a cold or a flu, and then it went into your chest and you had a persistent cough. Maybe it became bronchial or bacterial pneumonia. Now, the normal course of treatment was 7 days of antibiotics, and in many, many cases, they were denied the patients on advice again from above the level of nation. And large numbers of people died a ghastly death of treatable bacterial pneumonia. So, and then all of those deaths in hospital, care homes, and community were all ascribed to COVID. And there's your pandemic. There is your pandemic, ladies and gentlemen. So I've given you one reason why you wouldn't develop a vaccine. It cannot be done in 12 months. It would take years and years and years. If you do it faster, you've done it badly or incompletely, or you have not obtained the data to say that it works or is safe. So I don't know what they did exactly, but it was not a vaccine. So now I'm going to turn to something that probably of all the contributors only I can tell you, and that's that the design of these molecular structures in the vaccines, the injections, have no other purpose but to injure and kill. It's a huge claim. I've worked over 30 years with colleagues in what's called rational drug design. Every synthetic medicine, that is something not purified from nature, it consists of a series of atoms and molecules and formulations. Every single component in that vial, as it turns out, has to be chosen by a person. They're not there randomly. They're not there as a natural product. Someone decided to put them in there. And you put them in there because you have particular objectives: for the drug to be absorbed quickly or slowly, for it to last a long time or not, for it to go everywhere versus a certain area of the body, and so on. So when I look at the design of these molecules, I do it with the mind of a drug hunter, someone involved in rational drug design. And I will be able to tell you 3 or 4 things about these vaccines that are not accidental and undoubtedly would have as a consequence toxicity that was predictable and indeed predicted. Dr. Wolfgang Wodarg and I, in early December 2020, wrote a technical letter, an open letter, to the European Medicines Agency. And in that letter, we predicted, we had great concerns about the safety profile of these materials and begged that they not be developed further. And our objective was to reach many people.